Welcome to LinesToGo installation videos. Today we will be removing and installing fuel lines on a 2003 Honda Civic using LinesToGo part number FL1114. While this particular installation is being performed on a 2003 Honda Civic, this set of lines will also fit the following year, make, and models as shown on your screen now. LinesToGo lines are made using original equipment end forms and fittings that are CNC bent for an easy and precise installation. We have also upgraded to stainless steel braided Teflon hoses for rust protection and to prevent surface fouling. These have an unlimited shelf life and anti-static PTFE liner. This set of LinesToGo lines are made from G2 Galfan coated steel tubing for rust resistance that exceeds OEM standards. Tech tip: disconnect the battery before working on a vehicle to reduce the risk of shorting out the battery on tools or lines. LinesToGo lines are made with a sectional design for easier installation. We also use color-coded unions on our sectioned lines. Just match the colors at the connections. Make sure to depressurize the fuel system before starting the installation. Tools required: 8mm, 10mm, 12mm, 14mm, 17mm, and 19mm sockets and ratchet, 10mm and 14mm wrenches, pliers and cutting pliers, flat blade and Phillips screwdrivers, hammer, razor blade or sharp knife, drain pan, jack and jack stands. The level of difficulty for this installation is considered to be medium. To depressurize the fuel system, locate the fuel pump fuse using your owner's manual and remove it. Start the vehicle and wait for the engine to stall. Make sure to replace the fuse once completed. Start by disconnecting the negative battery terminal using a 10mm wrench. Next, use a 10mm socket to remove the 3 bolts that secure the first section of the plastic intake housing. Remove the tube from the passenger side of the housing and remove the housing from the vehicle. Next, use a 10mm socket to remove the 2 bolts that secure the front of the air filter housing. Use an 8mm socket to loosen the band clamp that secures the air filter housing to the throttle body. Disconnect the intake air temperature electrical sensor. Reposition the clamp that secures the PCV tube to the valve cover. Lift up on the air filter housing to remove it from the vehicle. If the rubber grommet stays on the throttle body, remove it and replace it onto the air filter housing for an easier installation. Locate it behind the engine. Use a 10mm socket to remove the bolt that secures the bracket at the end of the fuel lines. Next, use a 10mm socket to remove the bolt that secures the coolant flow control valve to the firewall and reposition the valve. Use a 10mm socket or wrench to remove the nut that secures the next fuel line bracket to the firewall and remove the bracket from the lines. Use a pair of pliers to remove the clamp that secures the vent hose to the line and remove the hose from the line. Remove the plastic bracket that covers the feed line quick connection along with the rubber insulator. Remove the hose from the feed line by pressing in on the 2 tabs to disconnect it. The plastic clip will remain attached to the pressure line. Remove the clip from the line prior to removing the line from the vehicle, as it can easily fall off and become lost. Next, raise and support the vehicle from the pinch welds under the rocker panels. Above the rear of the front subframe, use a 10mm socket or wrench to remove the bolt that secures the fuel line bracket at the bottom of the firewall. At the rear of the vehicle, in front of the fuel tank, use a 10mm socket to remove the metal bracket and remove the fuel lines from the bracket. Next, we will need to remove the bottom rear seat cushion to access the sending unit. Use a 10mm socket to remove the bolt at the rear of the seat towards the driver's side of the center seat. Under the front of the two outer seat cushions is a clip. Quickly lift up on the seat to disconnect the clips and remove the seat cushion from the vehicle. Next, use a Phillips screwdriver to remove the 4 screws that secure the sending unit cover. Lift up on the cover and disconnect the sending unit electrical connector. Disconnect the feed line by pressing in on the 2 plastic tabs to separate the quick connect fitting. Remove both front wheels using a 19mm socket. Next, use a 12mm socket to remove the bolts that secure the metal support located in front of the steering rack. Remove the support through the inner fender. Next, use a 17mm socket to remove the 3 bolts and 1 nut that secure the rack and pinion into position. You may need to turn the steering wheel left or right to access the bolts. Use a flat blade screwdriver to remove the 3 plastic clips that secure the rubber cover on the passenger side of the rack and pinion and remove the cover from the vehicle. Next, remove the cotter pin in the right outer tie rod end and use a 17mm socket to remove the nut that secures it to the right front strut. A few sharp hits with the hammer, being careful not to hit the tie rod end or the threads, will allow you to remove the tie rod end from the strut. Pull the passenger side of the rack and pinion forward as far as it will go. Next, remove the front lines from the plastic clip at the rear of the front subframe. Use a pair of cutting pliers to cut both lines behind the front subframe. Use a 10mm socket to remove the 2 nuts and 2 bolts that secure the shifter cables so that they can be repositioned while removing the lines. Remove both front fuel lines from the vehicle. Use a 12mm socket to remove the bolt that secures the left rear park brake cable in front of the fuel tank. Use a pair of pliers to remove both fuel lines from the plastic clips underneath the vehicle. Remove the fuel feed line from the vehicle. Use a pair of pliers to remove the rubber hose from the top of the passenger side of the charcoal canister. Use a pry bar or long screwdriver to remove the vent line from the plastic clips on the passenger side of the fuel tank. If the clips pull out of the body, remove them from the line once removed and replace them in the vehicle. Support the fuel tank. Use a 14mm socket to remove both bolts that secure the front of the fuel tank straps. Lower the front of the fuel tank to access the plastic clips above the tank. Remove the vent line from the two plastic clips located above the front of the fuel tank. Remove the rear section of the vent line from the vehicle. To begin the installation of your new LinesToGo fuel lines, remove the rubber hose from the rear section of the original vent line and install it onto your new vent line labeled VLA3. Next, install the rear section of the vent line labeled VLA3 into position. Secure the vent line into the two plastic clips located above the front of the fuel tank, along with the clips on the passenger side of the fuel tank. Connect the rubber hose to the top of the charcoal canister. Next, we will need to attach the molded nylon section of the rear supply line to the new LinesToGo supply line. Lay the new and old lines together, matching up the bends. Locate the matching straight section and mark the center. Cut both lines using a sharp razor blade and connect the old nylon section to the new line using the supplied shark bite fitting. Next, install the rear section of supply line labeled SLA2 into position, routing the rear of the line on top of the fuel tank. Raise the fuel tank into position and secure the fuel tank straps using a 14mm socket. Secure the fuel lines into the bracket located in front of the fuel tank and secure the bracket using a 10mm socket. Secure the parking brake bracket using a 12mm socket. Next, install the center section of the LinesToGo vent line labeled VLA2 into position. Connect the two vent lines at the hose connection, noting the LinesToGo color-coded connection. Secure the clamp using a pair of pliers. Secure the two rear lines into the plastic clips underneath the vehicle. Connect the supply line quick connect fitting at the sending unit. Connect the sending unit electrical connector. Replace the sending unit cover and secure it using a Phillips screwdriver. Replace the rear seat cushion, making sure to correctly position the seatbelt buckles into the cushion. Press down on the cushion to connect the clips at the front. Replace the bolt at the rear of the cushion using a 10mm socket. Next, install the front section of the LinesToGo supply line labeled SLA1 into position, routing it between the steering rack and the firewall. Connect the front and rear section of the supply line at the threaded union, noting the LinesToGo color-coded connection. Tighten the union using two 14mm wrenches. Next, install the front section of the LinesToGo vent line labeled VLA1 into position, routing it between the steering rack and the firewall. Connect the front and center sections of the vent line using the hose connection, noting the LinesToGo color-coded connection, and secure the connection using a pair of pliers. Secure the two lines into the plastic bracket at the rear of the front subframe. Install the plastic locking clip onto the supply line and connect the supply hose quick connect fitting. Connect the vent hose at the engine to the vent line and secure the clamp using a pair of pliers. Replace the rubber insulator along with the plastic bracket onto the lines. Position them onto the bracket on the firewall and secure it using a 10mm socket. Replace the steering rack back into its original position and secure it using a 17mm socket. Replace the right front outer tie rod end and tighten the nut using a 17mm socket and replace the cotter pin. Replace the support bar in front of the steering rack and secure it using a 12mm socket. Install the rubber cover back onto the passenger side of the steering rack and secure it with the plastic push clips. Next, install the metal bracket back onto the fuel lines at the top of the firewall and secure it to the firewall using a 10mm socket or wrench. Next, replace the coolant flow control valve back into position and secure it to the firewall using a 10mm socket. Underneath the vehicle, replace the two nuts and two bolts that secure the shifter cables to the floor using a 10mm socket. Replace the air filter housing back into position, making sure to slide the PCV tube onto the rear of the valve cover. Tighten the two bolts using a 10mm socket. Tighten the clamp at the throttle body using an 8mm socket. Connect the intake air temperature electrical connector on the driver's side of the air filter housing. Next, replace the plastic intake housing back into position. Place the tube on the passenger side of the housing. Tighten all three bolts using a 10mm socket. Replace both front wheels using a 19mm socket to torque to your manufacturer's recommended specification. Reconnect the negative battery terminal using a 10mm wrench. This concludes the installation of fuel lines on a 2003 Honda Civic using LinesToGo part number FL1114. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions or would like to purchase the lines you saw today, please call us at 1-855-781-5992. Email us at info@linestogo.com or check out our website link below. And don't forget to take advantage of our free 2-day shipping. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button below, and we will see you on our next video.